Mentioned yesterday that the Torah now, when Moshe speaks to Klal Yisrael, it's the last 36 days of his life. And he's giving them Musar, and he's reviewing the Torah in its entirety before he passes away. Ayleh HaDevarim, the numerical value of Ayleh is 36. So Rashi over here explains, Lefishe Divri Tochochos, since these are words of rebuke, of admonishment, Umona Kad Kol HaMakom Shechisu L'fnei HaMakom. Go ahead. And here he's mentioning all the locations which they enraged Hashem. Lefichach sochsam sadvarim. Therefore, he concealed his words. The remez nikvod shel Yisrael, meaning we'll see the locations he mentions are not locations, but rather it's allusions to times where they failed over the past 40 years. And why does the Torah not express it explicitly what the failing was and to what degree they failed? Nikvod shel Yisrael. What does this mean? As a result, to honor Klal Yisrael. Very often when you rebuke a person and you allude to certain things, he understands what you're saying. But if you rebuke him directly and you articulate and explain and verbalize exactly what happens, it's too much. It's too much for the person to deal with. So like you sideswipe it and it's sufficient, he understands what you're talking about. But if it's like confronting him and it's not an accusation, but rather it's a condemnation because one through so many, it's like you've destroyed the person. You have no respect. You've stripped the person of all his dignity because he can't live with his conscience. So that's one way to learn. That's Kvod Shel Yisrael. To be able to, so they should be able to deal with the issues. You are sensitive to their own existence to be able to deal with these issues. That's one way to learn. Kvod Shel Yisrael means we allude to it, which means we know what we're speaking about, but we don't allow it to be public knowledge. Because if it's explicit in Torah where they failed, it's like washing your dirty washing in public. We don't do these things. We know what we're talking about. It's between us, and we get the message. We understand what we have to correct, or we can't go back there again. That's Kvod Shel Yisrael. And the Torah makes it a point. These words of admonishment, he's speaking El Kol Yisrael, to all the Jews. I mean, every Jew that existed at that time was there at the time of these words of rebuke. If he would have admonished only some of them, those who weren't present or out in the market or elsewhere, they would say, Atem hayisem shomim ben Amram, lo hashivosem dover, mikach v'kach. You heard the words of Ben Amram, and you didn't respond. You should have responded such and such to defend yourselves. Ilo hayinu sham. If we would have been there when he was rebuking us, hayinu meshivin also, we would respond to defend our position. Lekach konsem kulam. He assembled all of them. V'amalem hari kulchem kan. You're all here. Anybody who has what to respond should respond. If you have a defense, and if I'm not saying it as it was, speak up. And if you can't speak up, then you have to accept whatever it is, whatever you did, the level of guilt of the past, or whatever has to be corrected or should not be repeated. Every one of you have relevance to that. There's an expression, people are spoilers. Meaning people say, if I would have been there, I would have spoken up. I would have said, I would have responded. And the moment that person says that, although the response is not a valid response, but it undermines and it takes the wind out of the sails of whatever was said initially. It undermines it. And Moshe Rabbeinu wanted that his word should have the full effect and the full brunt of what he means to communicate. Therefore, he gathered all of them. Nobody should make a claim. If we would have been responded, and therefore it's not a valid accusation or a valid admonishment, because we're not as guilty as he makes us out to be. Be'ever Yarden Bamidbar. What's Bamidbar? Lo Bamidbar Hoyu El Barvis Moav. At this point, where are they? They're not in the desert any longer. They're in the plains of Moab. Uma Bamidbar. What is he referring to when it says in the desert? El Bishul Bashichisu Bamidbar. They angered him in the desert. They angered Hashem. Shomer Miite Museinu. Initially, when they left Egypt and there was no water, they complained. And they said, did you take us out into the desert to die? I mean, after they saw all the miracles, the 10 makos, and now all of a sudden they say, we're going to die of thirst. Ba'arova, b'shvil ha'arova. What's arova? Shechotu be'bal por b'shitim ba'arvas moav. Arova is referring to Arvas Moav. What happened most recently? The sin of the Baal Peor, which nearly destroyed Klal Yisrael. I mean, this always bothered me. Bamidbar, he goes all the way back to when we left Egypt. And after he rebukes them for that, he goes fast forwards to the most recent event. The event of what? Of the Baal Peor. That's Arvas Moav. That's where they failed with this. I mean, why don't we go sequentially speaking? Midbar and all the sins that from then going forward. Well, why are we going to go from the beginning? Then we fast forward to the end. It always bothered me. I mentioned something else to me was difficult. The sin of where they claimed they were going to die because they didn't have water, they'd have food. That was a lack of faith. The story of Baal Peor had nothing with lack of faith. Bilam failed. He wasn't able to curse him. And he says to Balak that the God of the Jews will not tolerate licentiousness. And this is when the daughters of Moab went to seduce the men with the Baal Peor. It's not a lack of faith. It's not a lack of faith. This is temptation. They were lured into this very, very difficult situation, and they allowed themselves. All the other sins, we had enough this wafer food. We're going to die from it. That was questioning Hashem. This is not questioning Hashem. The Arovo, the Baal Peor, it's a different level of failing. If it's repetitive failing in the same area, you said, look, where have you come from the age, like you said, from the age of 13, 6 years later, you're still messing up in the same way. You haven't learned. But the Baal Peor has nothing to do with learned. The failing was temptation.
It sounds like it's more. Oh, sorry, you're still recording. No, it sounds like it's.
Get back to the intro. We first left Egypt. You say, and we had questions. You say, we're fresh out of the gate. We haven't yet matured, so we could attribute it to our lack of maturity. In Egypt, we were still slaves, even though we saw the 10 plagues, so on and so forth. Because we find over there, even when the Jews complained, they were not reprimanded. They were not reprimanded over there. It was a failing. Hashem provided the water, he provided the man, whatever it was. So you could attribute it to their lack of experience. The relationship is a new relationship. 40 years later, you understand, you can't attribute it and say it's a lack of experience. Here you've been well-weathered over 40 years. How do you feel with the Baal Peor? Even though it's a different type of sin, it doesn't make a difference. We're fast-forwarding, I mean, something what Mark was saying. You haven't matured yet. See, initially you attribute it to your level of immaturity, your lack of experience. Here you've been doing this for 40 years, exposed to a level of relationship which is one of a kind. And after 40 years, this is the way you behave. Therefore, it was a rebuke. Therefore, we start from the beginning. There, you're able to sweep it under the carpet, to somehow sideswipe the accusation. But here, after 40 years, there's no way you could sidestep this. That's why he's going from the beginning to the end. Okay? Mulsuf. What's Mulsuf? Amashe Himru al Yamsuf. Bevoim al Yamsuf. Shomer Amibli in Kfor b'Mitzrayim. We find that they were caught between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea, and they were opposite the Suf, that's Yam Suf. They said, are there a lack of graves in Egypt? Did you bring us here to die? They actually, they rebelled on the Yam. I mean, after all that you saw, how do you behave this way? How do you talk this way? That you were taken out to die? Ben Poran, Ben Tofel, Velovan, Amr B'Yochanan, Chozanu al Kol Mikro, Lo Motzinu, Mokum Shishmo, Tofel Velovan. He says he reviewed all the psukim, all the geography of locations. There's no location which is called Tofel or Lovan. Elochichon al Hadvorm Shetoflu al Amod Shu Lovan. They didn't appreciate the mon. They said this white wafer type of food. Shamu nafshenu kotzu lechem haklokel. We're disgusted with this lechem, this bread, which is klokel, which is this simple type of food. Chomashe osa b'midbar poron aydei meraglim. Tofel Lovan is referring to the complaint about the mon and the meraglim. Now, this is very interesting. I had once spoken about when we failed with the mon in the 40th year. This is the new generation. What did they say? We've had enough of the lechem haklokel. What's lechem haklokel? So Rashi over there explains the mon was a wafer, and any type of food that you had in mind that you wanted to take on that level of nourishment or that taste, it took on that taste. And they said, but you know something? It's been 40 years and we haven't done our bodily functions because the mon was absorbed in the inner organs. You know what's going to happen? It's unheard of that something enters your body and doesn't go out of your body. Ultimately, it's going to expand in our intestines, and our intestines, they're going to burst and we're going to die. So what does Hashem do? He sends the vipers and they start biting the Jews start dying. And what does the Gemara say in Avodah Zorah? He says to Klal Yisrael, you're ingrates who descend from the ingrate. Adam Arishon, after he ate of Deitz Hadas, and I said, why did you eat? You said, it's your fault, it's the woman that you gave me. So Adam was a Kafui Tova. So this flaw in character, Adam possessed, because this is the way he expressed himself. Identically, you're saying Yikfuye Tova, that this food, which is the ultimate, you're saying it's going to kill you. So Yikfuye Tova, Yikfuye Tova. This is what Hashem said to Klal Yisrael when they came with the complaint of the money. So now, The two expressions. There's a person who's not a makir tova, and a person who's a kofui tova. What's the difference? A person is not appreciative. He's not a makir tova. A kofui tova is something else. What's the difference? Why is a person not appreciative? Is it because he has a short memory? As you say, people have short memories. But in terms of, the Hebrew language is a very descriptive language. A person is appreciative, he's called a makir tova. What does that mean? He recognizes that he's a beneficiary of goodness. That's the meaning of makir tova. It's not he recognized that he has a short memory. A person who's not makir tova, what does that mean? He doesn't appreciate what you did for him. He's not makir tova. He doesn't recognize the good. As a result of that, he's not appreciative. So the basis for not being appreciative is because you don't recognize to what degree you're a beneficiary of the other person's goodness, what he had done for you. That's makir tova, or a person who's not makir tova. He's not makir tova. Kofui tova means I do something which is the ultimate for you, and then you say to me, you're trying to destroy me. The good thing, the good act that I did for you, what I provided, the service or the whatever it may be, rather than saying it's positive, you're saying it's detrimental to me. Why did Hashem create Chava for Adam? He was Ezer Kenegdo. Because ultimately, his success could only come through her. So now when he eats of the tree of knowledge, he says, the reason why I failed is because of that woman you gave me. That woman is a detriment to my life. Rather than, so what are you doing? You take something which is the ultimate and the positive, and you're turning it backwards. You're turning it upside down. It's not good, it's the worst. It's a detriment. The man was what? And Hashem says, if they eat food and they have to do their bodily functions, they have to go out of the camp to do their bodily functions. Having the man absorbing in their inner organs, their lives are not complicated. So what I provide for them, rather than seeing it as the ultimate in terms of maximizing on opportunity on life, they see it, this will end our lives, because ultimately it's going to expand our intestines and we're going to die from it. So that's kofui tova. You turn it upside down, you turn it backwards. That's the kofui tova. Now, the Jews were caught two things. Bein Poron and the Meraglim. We had 12 spies. What did the 10 spies say? And what did Yeshua and Kalev say? The 10 spies said, what we saw there was Eretz Ocheles Yoshvel, a land which devours its inhabitants. Why? Because wherever we went, we saw people burying their dead. Right? That's what the 10. So you see, and we saw giants. It's not survivable. People were dying wherever we went. What did Kalev and Yeshua say? Lachmeinuhu, we will devour him the way one eats bread. They both saw the exact same event. Kalev and Yeshua says this is a confirmation, we will succeed. And the other said, it's confirmation, no chance. What's the difference? And Kalev and Yeshua saw it right. Why were people dying wherever they went in Eretz Yisrael and Canaan? So the Medrash says, because if they're spying out the land and people notice them, they won't be able to fully scout out the land. But now that God brought a plague upon them, and everybody's burying their dead and they're being distracted and they're grieving in their own suffering, they're not going to be noticed. So Kalev and Yeshua saw it. This is a gift of Hashem. It's unbelievable. Wherever we go, people are dying. Hashem doesn't want us to be noticed. So they saw this as the ultimate and the positive. The Hashem says, Eretz Ovos Chol V'Dvosh. We don't question that. It is. So how do we reconcile with people dying? There's only one answer, that we should not be noticed. The others who didn't trust God, they said people are dying. This only confirms what we suspected. As a result of that, they said this is not survivable. So it's seeing it backwards. The way Kalev and Yeshua saw it, they saw it correctly. And because they saw it correctly, they said this is Eretz Zavos Cholim Dvosh. The others said it may be that, but it's not for us because it's not survivable. So the sin of the Mon and the sin of the Meraglim are the exact same sin. You're seeing it backwards. The Meraglim saw it backwards. The Jews, when they complained about the Mon, they saw it backwards. Something that was the ultimate, they saw it as the most negative. So therefore, these two failings go hand in hand, the Mon and the Meraglim. Adam failed by eating the Eitz. What happened to him? He was declassified. He lost the classification of Adam. Now, who assumed that persona of Adam? Klal Yisrael, Sinai. Atem Kriyim Adam, Vehem Lo Kriyim Adam. You're classified as Adam, the nations were not classified as Adam. Meaning the objective of creation, which has to be met, initially was meant to be met by Adam, because he failed, he was disqualified. We assume that level of capacity to address the objective of creation, of Adam. What was Adam's challenge? Adam's challenge was this Kafui Tova. Right? After he failed, how does he express himself? Rather than accepting guilt and recognize it's him, he tries to pass it on to someone else. We did the same thing. This is a characteristic of Adam. This is part of our challenge. How do we see it? Are we looking to blame someone? Or do we recognize it ourselves that it's our own personal failing and we do tshuva? Where is it coming from? The Medrash tells us at the beginning of, over there by the chet of Adam Rishon, Hashem says to Adam, Ayeko. Right? It says they were hiding because they realized they were naked. And Hashem says, Ayeko. So the Medrash says over there, Ayeko is an expression of tshuva. Hashem said to Adam, you should do tshuva. And if Adam would have done tshuva at that moment, he wouldn't have been driven out of the garden of Gan Eden. But because he did not do tshuva, that's why he was driven out. So why did he do tshuva? Hashem is coaxing him. Do tshuva, Ayeko. Where are you? What did you do? You know what he says? God, it's your fault. So this characteristic of Kafui Tova, not except because what's tshuva? The key element in tshuva is charota. You have remorse. You recognize how you failed. To admit that you failed is not an easy task. Adam, Hashem says, Ayeko. All you have to do is admit, recognize what you did wrong. Rather than saying that, what does he say? Hashem, it's your fault. It's the woman you gave me. So the flaw of Kafui Tova did not allow him to do tshuva. We're always passing the guilt off onto someone else. It's called the blame game. Someone else. It's the Navi. It's Hashem. Well, many things. And that's something we have to contend with even till today. That's a flaw in us, even though we're Adam. Even though our classification is Adam, we see it with the Mon, and this is the ultimate generation. This generation was the one who survived the Meraglim. And they still have this flaw. Lechem HaKlokel. Every one of us, whenever a problem arises, who do you blame? Usually, unless you're somebody who can rise above the fray. You blame your parents. You blame your siblings. You blame your teachers. You blame the Torah leaders. You blame everybody, but rather than recognizing it's your own failing. But this is innate in the personality, in the makeup of what? Even Adam, of Klal Yisrael. Now it's interesting, we're going to read Mitz Hashem, Shabbos Nachma, we read Veschanon. What's Veschanon? Moshe Rabbeinu supplicating Hashem he should be able to go into Eretz Yisrael. And the Medrash tells us the 10 expressions of tefillah. One expression of tefillah is chanun. We ask Hashem to be gracious to us. What's gracious? So Rashi over there cites the Midrash, matnas chinam, that the tzaddikim, when Moshe prayed, he prayed not that he's deserving, but only due to the graciousness of Hashem. Hashem should listen to his supplication to be able to go into Eretz Yisrael. Because tzaddikim always ask for matnas chinam, always ask, it should be gratis. Why? Because a person understands in terms of what Hashem provides us with, God's not our debtor. He's paid out his what he's responsible for endless times over. And if you recognize that he's not your debtor, whatever he does to you is only due to his graciousness. Therefore, that's the term veschanon, matnas chinam. It's gratis. What does a person always feel and looks for the blame game? It's not me. It's really rooted in you owe it to me. You owe it to me. You created a scenario, you did the wrong thing to me. You owe it to me. They really cross lines very often. You owe it to me, and the blame game goes goes hand in hand. You don't see it right. Because if you owe it to me, you shouldn't have thrown me that curveball. You shouldn't have created that level of temptation. You're always trying to fault the other. And that's every one of these failings. Machatzeros. Machalchusa shel Korach. The story of Korach. Because initially, the Jews came with a complaint. Even though it was Korach, and Korach nearly succeeded in his mutiny against Moshe Rabbeinu. Davar acher, omelem hoy lechem lilmod b'masher sisi leMiriam b'chatzeres b'shul loshen hara. Batem nidbartem b'mokom. Now this is the question. What happened with Miriam? She spoke loshen hara. She spoke critically of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Torah juxtaposes the meraglim to the sin of Miriam. What are we supposed to learn from that juxtaposition? These evil people, they saw what happened to Miriam, and they didn't draw a lesson. Because if they would have drawn the lesson, they wouldn't have come back with their negative reports about Eretz Yisrael. They spoke lashon hara. Because if Hashem says Eretz Zovos Chol Udvosh, although you have a problem, you have to understand it is that. Just as Miriam, because she saw it her way, therefore she was critical of Moshe. But if she would have seen it as she should have seen it, she would have never been critical, because that's what Hashem says to Moshe, to Miriam. It's Moshe Avdi. Firstly, he's Moshe. Secondly, he's Avdi. So if I have that special relation with him, the way you see it, you're seeing it definitely wrong. Because if you're right, I wouldn't have that level of relationship. So that confirms that your whole evaluation is off, is not correct. If Hashem says Eretz Zovos Chol Udvosh, that's the lesson they should have drawn. But we see people dying. Well, you have to reconcile it. To understand the dying is the way Kalev and Yeshua saw it, not the way you people see it. They did not learn Musa. But this is the Meraglim. But what happened with the Meraglim? Klal Yisrael went after the 10, not after the 2. You saw what happened to Miriam. And what would have been the lesson, the takeaway? You know, it's very interesting. Miriam, because she had waited for Moshe Rabbeinu when he was put into the Nile to see what was going to happen, measure for measure, we waited during this period of time that she was a leper. We waited 7 days. And the Medrash says, the Shechina waited, the Yaakov waited, at 600,000 men above the age of 20 waited until she was able to come back into the camp. And that's measure for measure. That's a reward. So we'd ask the question, I mean, is there any greater public embarrassment than that? That every Jew was aware of the failing of Miriam. That's what happened. I'm doing you a favor, Miriam. We're going to wait for you. Don't do me any favors. Just travel ahead. I'll catch up. She didn't have a rock to hide under, Miriam. That's how obvious it was to all that she spoke Lashon Hara. She became a leper, which is very, very severe. She was persona non grata. She was out of the camp for a week. So we asked, that's measure for measure. So we explained it. But even more than that, let's say Klaus wouldn't have been aware of what happened to Miriam. The Meraglim, let's say, were aware, but Klaus were not aware. They wouldn't have actually, the claim against them wouldn't have been it. With the Meraglim wouldn't have been a claim. The Meraglim come back with negative reports. What was the failing of Meraglim? You should have learned from Miriam, and you did not. That was the claim against them. Let's say Klaus wouldn't have been aware what happened to Miriam. They had no way to learn from. Seemingly, what we hear is disastrous. But just as Miriam should have seen it right, and it was proven that she did not see it right, because Hashem had said it's Moshe Abdi, identically, if I say it's Eretz Zovis Cholav Dvosh, regardless of what you see, you somehow have to reconcile it, that it is the ultimate situation. So that it was public knowledge was the basis for the condemnation of Klal Yisrael, why that generation died over 40 years. They had no saving grace because you had what to learn from and you didn't learn. And if that's the case, you're gonna have the consequence of that. You people are not going to go into the land. Dizahov. There's no location called Dizahov. He was rebuking them for the Chet Egel. Also Bishul Rov Zov Shoyelehem. Why did he do the Chet Egel? Because of the amount of gold that they had to take out of Egypt. Shenemar, the Chesed Hirbesi, law. I've given an enormous amount of silver, V'zov also Labal, and they took the gold and they made it for the Baal, for the idolatry of Baal. That these are. I've given you so much gold. What you do with the gold? I give you, person wins the $40 million lottery, and you're able to support every yeshiva for the next 6 months. And you say, this is my opportunity. I'm going to Atlantic City. I'm going to take a vacation. And you use the money for everything except for what it was meant to be used for. And you do things you shouldn't do. I've given you Dizov, I've given you so much, and what do you do with it? Rather than putting it where it belongs, you go and you're drawn into the idolatry. That's the claim. Dizov. But it's interesting. The Gemara tells us in Brochos, the Gemara that Rashi is alluding to, this was the fence. When Hashem says to Moshe, I will destroy them, the Gemara says, what do you expect? A person says to his son, he dresses him the finest, he puts a gold chain around his neck, gives him a purse of gold, and he gives him cologne to wear, and he says, when you go near the brothel, don't walk through the door. After creating that scenario for that son, do you expect him not going to the brothel? Moshe says to Hashem, you want to destroy them, but don't you created the problem. By giving him so much gold, you can't blame them for failing. That was a defense. I mean, here Moshe, when he speaks to them, this is the basis for the admonishment. Hashem is giving you so much. Is that what you do with it? But the other side of the coin is when it came to defend Klal Yisrael, he says to Hashem, you can't fault them. You created the setting for them to fail. Therefore, they're fully culpable. Therefore, there's a basis for Rachmi. And that was the basis to supplicate Hashem that they should be forgiven. They should not be destroyed. So it's the exact same point, but the two sides to that same point. When he speaks to them, you shouldn't have failed. After Hashem being so generous with you. To Hashem, you've given so much, you expect him not to fail. It was too difficult for them.
Rabbi,